Welcome back. Chapter 50, Thursday, July 20th, 2017. Early Thursday morning, with her voicemail filled with Meg Sags messages and unanswered texts blinking on her phone, Sydney emerged from the elevator to find her office floor empty, too early yet for staff to be present. She walked in and sat behind her desk, immediately assaulted by a barrage of yellow sticky notes pasted on her computer, her desk, her phone, and any flat surface available. Where are you? Are you alive? Corporate needs edits today. Left several messages. I'm pissed. They were all written in Leslie's familiar handwriting. Shit, Sydney said to herself. She spun her chair towards the window to look out over the city and grabbed her phone from her purse and dialed Leslie's number. She pressed the phone to her ear and heard a chiming ringtone behind her. When she swiveled back around, Leslie stood in the office doorway, holding the ringing phone up for Sydney to see. "Oh," Leslie said in an exaggerated tone, looking at Sydney's name on the phone. "It's my friend and co-producer calling. Since we're under a shitstorm of a deadline and I know she's calling about said shitstorm, I think I'll let it go to voicemail." Sydney ended the call with a quick finger tap. The chiming stopped. "I'm sorry, Les." "And then," Leslie said, "when I see that she left a message plus 1,000 texts, I think I'll ignore them all." "Got it. I'm a bitch." "And you're selfish. The suits threw a fit yesterday when we missed the deadline, and since none of them could get a hold of you, they took it out on me." "Yep. They left me a few messages too. None were very pleasant, if that helps at all." "It doesn't." Leslie walked into the office and stood in front of the desk. "What the hell, Sid?" Sydney shook her head. "Look, I'm sorry I was gone yesterday, but we've got a major problem. Or I don't know, possibly a major problem. Yeah, production needed cuts for episode 8 yesterday, and we didn't deliver them. We have nothing decent to give them, and even if we did, there's not enough time to pull an episode together by tomorrow night. So yeah, I'd say we have a major problem." "Well," Sydney considered this, "then we've got more than one problem. But mine's bigger than yours." Leslie crossed her arms over her chest. "What's going on?" Sydney stared at her producing partner for a moment as yesterday's events spun through her mind. "I think Grace killed Julie and Chris." That's the end of chapter 50. Chapter 51. Thursday, July 20th, 2017. "Good," Graham said as he entered Sydney's office. "You're here." "Graham, before you start." "Nope," Graham said in a calm voice. "Not before I start. Not after I start. I'll talk, you listen. You too," he said to Leslie. "You are an employee of this network. I'm your boss. When I call you regarding a deadline, you call me back. Not the next day, not a week later. We have millions of dollars tied up in a project that you're producing. None of your staff knew where you were yesterday. No one had answers to why the deadline was being missed. This is not some shit show for Netflix. This is a prime time production for a major television network. You follow our rules or we cut you loose. We don't have renegades here. You want to act like some free-spirited filmmaker? Go back to the internet. The edits were due to production yesterday for Friday's episodes. Where are they?" "Graham." "Sydney, are the edits ready?" "No." "Why not?" "Something came up." "Did someone in your immediate family die?" "No." He pointed his index finger at her like he was throwing a dart. You signed a contract to produce 10 episodes this summer, 1 episode per week. You outlined that format. You pitched that format. We brought that format. We all understood it would require long hours and tight deadlines, and you promised you could handle it. We took a chance on you, and now we have one of the biggest audience in television history prepared to tune into tomorrow night for an episode we're not going to air. What the hell, Sid? His tie was crooked and the sleeves of his suit jacket had crept up his forearm during his rant. Leslie and I were just discussing our options, and we both agreed we need a filler episode for tomorrow night. Filler? A recap, Sydney said. A summary episode of what's taken place so far. It's the perfect time for it. It'll help reluctant viewers who don't want to commit to streaming 7 hours of television. A recap episode will bring everyone up to date and prime them for the final episode. Ray should love this idea. More viewers mean more money to stuff into his already fat pocket. And instead of 10 episodes, he gets 11. I don't understand your contempt for the success of your own documentary. Yes, the network is making money, but so are you. At least you stand to if you don't crap all over this thing. And you're positioned to make much more money when Sandberg offers you a contract to produce another documentary for next summer, which he had planned to do. But hell if that's going to happen now. And at the moment, I don't know that I'm fully behind the idea of rehiring you for another go-round. Let's not overreact, Graham. I missed a deadline. I'm not concerned with your career today. What's most pressing is that I need an episode for tomorrow night. Sydney took a deep breath. It had always been a challenge to balance her personal relationship with Graham and the reality of the professional hierarchy at the network. She wanted to call him an asshole for screaming at her like a lunatic and for walking so abruptly out of the bar a couple of nights ago, and she would have done exactly that had this encounter occurred anywhere but her office, with Leslie as an eyewitness and with the door wide open. Sydney was sure her entire staff was standing on tiptoes just outside her office, craning their necks to hear every syllable. Instead of calling him names, Sydney decided to bluff with the straightest face she could manage. Leslie and I will cut the recap episode today. We don't have to shoot anything new besides narrative from me. Maybe have the sound guy record some voiceover. All the footage will come from previous episodes. We'll do it this morning and have it to production by this afternoon. I'll work with them all day, and I won't leave until the episode is polished. And next week, it'll be an original episode. Graham ran his hand through his hair, pulled on his cuffs to bring his suit into order. I'm meeting with Sandberg now. I'll let him know about the recap and that I think it's a good idea. Sydney felt like he wanted to say something more to her, softer, she imagined, than the tone he had taken to this point. But whatever she saw in his eyes or heard in his voice, all she got was a subtle nod before he turned and walked out of her office. When he was gone, Leslie opened her palms. Why didn't you tell him? That the girl I just had exonerated is guilty as sin? A few reasons. 1, Sandberg will lose his mind. 2, I'd be fired, which would mean you'd get fired. 3, I wouldn't be able to finish this thing the way I want to the end. And 4, I'm not sure about a damn thing yet. So what's the plan? I don't know, but I got a week to figure it out. That's the end of chapter 51. Chapter 52, Thursday, July 20th, 2017. She worked in the production studio without breaks alongside the sound engineers, writers, and the graphic text. At 3:30 p.m., as instructed, she turned in the cuts for the recap episode. Graham, Graham and Ray quickly voiced their displeasure with her work and delivered a long list of changes. Sydney and Leslie slogged through them until 8 p.m. Production waited unhappily as the summer sun set on a Thursday night and darkness covered the city. By 9, they had the final cut of the summary episode, greenlit by the network heads and cued for Friday night's broadcast. Sydney felt no relief. The clock had reset and had begun ticking again. She had less than 1 week before the next episode was due, and she had no idea what the content would be. She left the office and dismissed her craving for a Casamigos. Grace Sabole, still stashed away in Ellie's high-rise, was her next stop. It was a confrontation she had avoided thinking about all day, but one she could put off no longer. She took a cab to Tudor City and found Windsor Tower. Sydney gave her name and waited while the doorman called upstairs. When he gave her the okay, Sydney slid into the elevator just before the doors closed. Grace was waiting in the hallway when the car arrived. "Hi," Grace said. Grace looked better than Sydney had ever seen her. Her prematurely graying hair was fashionably styled, a stark change from the matted down prison do that Sydney had known from her visit in St. Lucia's. Allowed to pamper herself with products other than prison-issue bar soap and foam shampoo, included assistance from a layer of foundation and blush that hid the pallor of her skin. The transformation was remarkable. "Wow, you look... Is it cliche to say beautiful?" Grace smiled. "I don't care if it's cliche. It's the first time someone called me that in years. I actually feel like a person again. Come in." Sydney walked into the apartment. The long windows were filled with the lights of New York City. "No Derek?" Grace asked. "No, we'll get more footage later, maybe next week. I need to talk with you about something that's come up." "Sure, whatever you need. Ellie's not home from work yet. She was called in for a delivery." "Who is it?" came a voice from the other room. Sydney recognized the slightly slurred speech of Marshall. "It's Sydney," Grace said. "He's been more..." Grace wobbled her head back and forth as she chose a word. "Outgoing since I've been home. My parents tell me anyway. They said he had coiled into himself the last few years, but now he's talking more. It's a good thing, but with guests, he can be a little overwhelming." "Marshall and I have met before," Sydney said, "even before the other night. I spoke with him when I interviewed your parents originally. We actually played a game of chess." Grace smiled. "Of course you did. He can sucker anyone into a game. He's such a con man." They walked into the large living room decorated with contemporary furniture and modern art. Everything was at sharp right angles. Ellie Reiser, Sydney thought again, is doing well for herself. "Marshall," Grace said, "you remember Sydney, don't you?" Marshall sank into his wheelchair and looked down at his lap, his curled wrist and fingers slinking between his knees. Sydney smiled. "Hi, Marshall. Do you want to play chess?" Marshall asked, his voice muffled as he spoke into his chest. "Sydney didn't come to play chess, Marshall." "Just one game like before?" Marshall said. Graham looked at Sydney and smiled. Sorry, he's a little stir-crazy locked away up here with me. As soon as we're done shooting whatever remaining scenes you need, Marshall and I are thinking of heading up to Ellie's lake house for a change of scenery. It'll be good for both of us. Probably a good idea. Will you play? Marshall asked again. Sydney shrugged. I'll have a game, Marshall. You'll remember that I'm not very good. You're a saint, Grace said. She looked at Marshall. One game, a fast one. Marshall took his hands from his lap and placed them on the wheels of his chair to roll himself into the den, where his chess set waited. As he passed Grace, she stuck her foot out and stopped the wheelchair progress. But only if you walk. Uh-oh. Marshall looked up from his chair, took his hands from the wheels, and placed them back into his lap, his chin falling again to his chest. Nope, Grace said. That works for Mom, not on me. You either walk to the den and sit on the couch, or Sydney doesn't play with you. Sydney stood quietly as she watched the interaction between the siblings, catching both an aura of friendship and a maternal nature of an older sister who likely had been the only person besides his parents that Marshall could rely upon. Do you want to play or not? Grace asked. Finally, Marshall pushed himself up from his wheelchair and walked to the den in only a slightly altered gaunt. His orthopedic shoes clapping as he marched. As soon as he sat on the couch and began to assemble the chess set, he uncurled his wrist and stiff fingers magically unfolded as he gripped the pieces to place them on the board. The transformation in stature, Sydney noted, was remarkable. She remembered something similar from weeks before at the Sabold's home. He can do that a lot on his own, Grace said, but he has to be pushed. The TBI, the brain injury, has led to progressive muscular dystrophy. Muscular dystrophy. I know the word, I just said it wrong, y'all. If he doesn't use his muscles, he'll lose them. He never used to be this bad. It nearly broke my heart the first time I saw him in a wheelchair when he visited me in Bordellis. I was shocked to get home and see that it had progressed so much. My damn parents haven't been making him help himself for years. Without motivation, he'll just sit in that chair and let his body atrophy to the point of brittleness. He doesn't know any better. He can't help himself unless he's reminded. Now that I'm around, he's reminded often, more than he likes. I think he's getting tired of me. I doubt that, Sydney said. Chess is his only interest. When he plays chess, his physical ailments disappear. His muscles loosen, and he can use his hands and fingers just as well as you or me. His speech improves and the slur disappears. The doctors explain it as tapping into a small portion of his brain that he can't access any other way than through the analytics of chess. When he utilizes this part of his mind, it supersedes his physical limitations. Essentially, when he's playing chess, he's his old self. Even though he doesn't notice the change, at least he's never mentioned it. I think it's why he likes playing chess so much. That's amazing, Sydney said, watching Marshall sit and move as if he had no physical ailment. He walks really well. It was worse just after I got home. It's better now, in just a few days since I've been pushing him. I remember the doctor telling us, before I went away, that with physical therapy, he could reasonably walk for many years, well into his 30s. maybe even his 40s, before he was confined permanently to a wheelchair. I just have to stay on him. My parents, I love them, but Marshall has been a lot to handle. He'll need more help than I can give him, but my parents were ready to shuffle him off to a full care facility. Hold up. He's not ready for that, and neither am I. As soon as neither am I. As soon as things settle down with the media, I hope to move back home and take better care of him until I can get a place of my own. Sydney blinked as she stared at Grace. Seeing her with Marshall made this visit harder than it was already going to be. Hold on. You're a good sister. Sorry, y'all, my phone fell. I'll make coffee, go play chess, then we'll talk. What's going on, by the way? Any problems? Sydney hesitated before she answered. I'm not sure yet. Grace gave a quizzical expression. She nodded towards the kitchen. We'll talk when you're done. She squeezed Sydney's wrist. Thank you for playing with him and for treating him like an equal. Grace headed to the kitchen and Sydney turned to the den where Marshall was organizing the pieces on his new chessboard, the one his sister had purchased for him on her return home after 10 years in jail. She walked into the den and sat down across from him. I like the new chess set, Sydney said. Marshall offered an indifferent look. It's not as nice as my old one. Sydney remembered the porcelain set from weeks before when she played chess in Marshall's bedroom. The intricate medieval pieces replaced now with traditional wooden figures. The cheap composite plastic chess case she looked at today seemed quite a leap from the elaborate pine wood case that held the competing black and white pieces. Why did Grace buy you a new one? Your old chess set was beautiful. She doesn't like to play on the old one. It brings back bad memories for her, so she asked me to put it away. For as long as she was gone, I did, and I only took it down once when you and I played. Why does it bring back bad memories for her? Marshall shrugged. Just reminds her of her old life. She wants a new life. I don't blame her. Like this chess set, I think she's hoping her new life will be simpler than her old one. Black or white? Marshall asked. Sydney looked down at the pieces. White. He pushed the stray pieces from his previous game with Grace over to Sydney. She arranged them in order. You open, Marshall said. Sydney moved her pawn forward. Marshall quickly advanced his own pawn immediately opposite. Why do you like chess so much? Sydney asked. Marshall shrugged. I don't know. No idea? I guess it's because I used to play football and chess is a way to compete. Your mom tells me that you were quite a star in high school. Marshall stayed quiet. You still miss it? Football. He shrugged again. I don't watch it. I've never been able to watch an NFL or college game. It just makes me think of what might have been. Chess brings out that competitive edge. Is that why you never lose? I lose, Marshall said. I just don't like it when I do. Sydney looked toward the kitchen. Grace was out of sight. Sydney heard the faucet running as Grace filled the coffee pot. She looked back to Marshall. When we talked last time, Sydney said, when you and I played chess at your house, you told me that you knew a lot about Grace's friends. Yeah, Marshall said, staring at the chessboard. That you listened a lot and that people underestimated your awareness. I remember. Sydney hesitated just a moment. What can you tell me about Henry Anderson? The mention of Grace's high school boyfriend caused Marshall to look up from the chess pieces. He made eye contact just briefly before returning his gaze to the board. What do you want to know? Sydney paused. I want to know how the same thing could happen to two different people who loved your sister. A long stretch of silence followed, while Marshall scrutinized the chessboard before he spoke. You know, it's funny. I was thinking about the last time we played chess, too, he finally said, looking up from the board. You told me that everyone involved in my accident likely had regrets about it. That Ellie especially must carry remorse for that night. You remember telling me that? I do, Sydney said. Are you still angry at Ellie because of the accident? Marshall shook his head. I was never mad at Ellie. No? No, Marshall said. She wasn't driving. Ellie wasn't driving, y'all. Sydney sat back. She sensed something happening between them, stayed quiet. Grace insisted on driving. He said. Ellie offered, but Grace got behind the wheel anyway. Ellie knew the consequences for Grace. Her best friend drunk and in a bad car accident. Neither of them was injured. So before the police arrived, they switched places and Ellie climbed behind the wheel. The other driver, the U-Haul guy, had been drinking. The blame fell on him, which was perfect for Ellie and Grace. It took them both off the hook. For me, Marshall looked back down at his board. It didn't really matter. Another moment of silence fell between them. What does that have to do with Henry Anderson? Sydney asked. I was mad at Grace for a long time. She got away with it, and I was stuck the way I am. Bad back then, worse today. Worse still in the future. But my anger at Grace didn't last. The two of us, we have a connection that no one else understands. Because you saved her when you donated your bone marrow. Yeah, that's part of it. But lots of people donate marrow. After the accident, I realized that I needed her to help me when my body fails. Grace knew it too. I couldn't stay angry with her for long, and I was relieved when she came home. Still, Marshall, how does Henry Anderson play into all of this? Now that Grace is back, I refuse to lose her again. I've kept their secret long enough. Ellie and Grace's secret about the accident? And all the other secrets that group has hidden and buried. Sydney glanced towards the kitchen, then back to Marshall. What other secrets? Marshall cocked his head as he analyzed the board in front of him and contemplated his next move. Marshall, what other secrets? You figured out that Daniel and Ellie were the only friends who stayed in contact with Grace. You have to know by now that they are both in love with her. I knew it. It must be obvious to you. Sydney blinked a few times, leaned forward slightly. In love with Grace? It's sad, even today, all these years later. Marshall moved his rook. You mean they love Grace? They're not in love with Grace. No, Marshall said, finally looking into Sydney's eyes. I said it right the first time. You heard him, girl. He said it right the first time. Sydney waited without speaking as Marshall leaned over, opened the desk drawer, and pulled out a cloth bag. It contained Grace Lovelock, which Marshall held up. You know she kept this the whole time my sister was gone. Who? Ellie. She kept it hidden away after Grace went to prison. It was important that no one found it after Sugar Beach. She probably pretended it belonged to her and tried to ignore what it really represented. I was surprised she actually handed it over when Grace was allowed a few personal items in jail. They both hate this love lock, Daniel and Ellie. They each wanted their own name under Grace's. He dropped it back into the long cloth bag and handed it to Sydney, who slipped a large antique love lock into her hand with a strange feeling of foreboding in her gut. Ellie or Daniel hated the names on that lock. Sydney looked down at the lock. It was as big as her palm, heavy and old. A two-pronged key extended from the locking mechanism at the bottom. Etched onto the surface were two names, Grace and Julian. First of all, I gotta pause right here. Where the heck is Grace? What's taking her so long? It was just as Sydney remembered from the first time Grace showed her the lock at Bordella's correction facility. They hate names, Sydney said. Grace and Julian? Julian and Henry, Marshall said, analyzing the chessboard again. Henry's name is not on this lock, Marshall. Not anymore. It used to be underneath. Sydney looked more closely at the lock and noticed the scruffs in the surface where Julian's name was located. Sydney imagined Henry's name scrawled there originally, scratched over and erased some years later to produce a clean slate for Julian's title. The weight in her stomach grew heavier. That lock has been a dangerous thing over the years, Marshall said. It caused a lot of pain. But I'm done keeping secrets. He shook his head. My loyalty is waning. I know everyone underestimates me, assumes I'm unaware of the things that go on around me, but I'm not going to let the same thing happen again. I warned Grace that I wouldn't. Warned Grace about what? Sydney asked. You obviously looked into Henry Anderson's case. I know you must be what you must be thinking. Grace will never tell the truth. She's too loyal. I don't want my sister tried again for a crime she didn't commit. Marshall tapped the chessboard with his fingers. Your move, he said. Make it a good one. Sydney looked around the den and then glanced towards the kitchen one last time. She heard the coffee pot gurgling and Grace clicking the mugs as she pulled them from the cabinet. Sydney slipped the love lock back into the mess satchel. As she did, she felt its smooth, round edge. Her mind flashed to the side-by-side photos of Julian Henry's skull fracture that Livy Cuddy had shown her the day before. The veins in Sydney's neck pulsed more rapidly. Her breathing became shallow and inefficient. She mindlessly moved chess pieces for another 16 minutes until Marshall announced checkmate. Oh my God, that's the end of chapter 52. There was so much stuff going on in this chapter. First of all, let me get this thought out before I forget. Grace, I feel like she is setting this up, right? She was in that kitchen way too long. Marshall came off with the information way too quick. And I already knew that Ellie was kind of like either jealous, envious of Grace and did something. And I always thought Ellie was on my list of suspects. But I'm just not too convinced that Marshall is not he ready to spill the beans. I think that Grace know why Sydney is there to talk to her, because she's following some type of information. Remember, she was on the internet looking at Julian's death and Henry's death. So she know Sydney is on her trail about Henry. So she set Marshall up because Marshall and her are close. They keep mentioning it. They keep mentioning it, how close her and Marshall are. So Marshall is about to, ooh, ooh, Grace is smooth. Let me, I'm gonna see y'all in the next chapter. Tell me what y'all think. Am I going on the right path? And that lock, I said the lock was the weapon. Y'all tell me what y'all think. Are we? Am I? Do I got a point? See y'all in the next chapter. Bye.